Welcome to Open Documentation Hour. Thank you all so much for coming today. It's very special today because we have a guest and we also have a guest presenter. So I'm going to hand you over to Theodora to introduce the rest of the session. And we'll have a questions and answer session later. So over to you, Dora.
Let me share my screen. So hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Theodora Mihok, also known as Dora. And today, I, together with our guest of honor, Joost, will be talking about sewing, open source, and docs. But before we start the dialogue, let me tell you a little bit about how I got to meet Joost. See, a few months ago, I started getting into sewing. It's become a big interest of mine. And one night I was voraciously browsing Pinterest for the latest, pattern drafting clip. And somebody mentioned this new project, FreeSewing, that allowed you to create bespoke sewing patterns. So that piqued my curiosity, and I went and took a look at it. And it looked very stylish, right? So I started scrolling. And it seemed very straightforward. It said, pick a design, add a set of measurements, and then customize the pattern. So I go ahead and do precisely that. I pick a simple thing. Let's make an apron, right? And I go and click on this button there and start, it said, pick a design and add your measurements and customize. So I pick the design and no, I don't want to bother. I'm lazy. I just want to see what it does. So I just pick an existing set of measurements. And one of these people here maybe measures my size. So I pick one. And then indeed, I get this pattern. For those of you who are new to sewing, the big thing you see there is basically an apron folded into two. That's the usual way you get it before you cut the fabric and so on. And I want to draw your attention to this thing here on the right. It's a lot of customization options, right? I will not go through all of that because I really want to make time for the conversation that's coming up. But suffice it to say, I tweaked a few things, and now I got my pattern. And I do want to highlight, so as a sewing enthusiast, I really loved this option I got here to create a paperless pattern. You see, usually my difficulty with online patterns is that you need to have a printer, and I could go to a printing shop, but it's not very near me. So I really loved how I could generate a paperless pattern, which means I can just look at the measurements provided here on this grid, and I can transfer them onto a piece of paper or onto fabric, and I'm good to go, right? So I met Joost as a sewing enthusiast, and as a sewing enthusiast, so far I'm in. By the way, at that point, I did not know there was a Joost, right? So coming up. I could have gone and just done my sewing, but there was another thing that caught my eye. See, I'm a long-time open source enthusiast, and I look here at this page, and there are so many elements here that really catch my eye. There are the usual, community standards, the obligations to be nice. But there's a lot of other things. So I clicked through a few, and I just want to highlight some that really stood out to me. First, there's this FreeSewing revenue pledge. All revenue will be donated to Doctors Without Borders. How nice is that? It's everything that's beautiful about open source. They just, that you run into really inspiring people and with an inspiring vision and who want to make the world a better place, right? So then the other thing that caught my eye. So I really, enough the obligations already. Sometimes I want some rights. And look at this, there's this beautiful page that tells me all about my rights as a FreeSewing user. And just take a minute to take a look at this list. It's just inspiring, right? The right to object. I mean, who doesn't like to object? Not just that you're informed of your rights, but also it's being made very easy for you to actually follow through and claim those rights. Check out the tip. It says, hey, you want the right to restrict processing? Go to Dell place. There you go. It's easy, right? And, then I saw this thing on the homepage of the website that says, FreeSewing, come for the sewing patterns, stay for the community. And I'm like, yeah, right? Like, as an open source enthusiast, I mean. But in my day job, I'm actually a technical author at Canonical. I'm a documentation professional, and documentation really catches my eye as well. And one of the things that struck me about this website and the entire project is how often the word documentation appeared. first of all, what you're looking at is the generic, the general entry point user docs, design user docs. And then whenever you click on any design, you might have noticed this big button. This is documentation. There's documentation for every single design. And you might wonder, well, what does that include? You get an idea of it a little bit here up front. See, you're told about the sewing techniques you must have mastered before you can successfully complete this project. There's a difficulty level and so on. And then when you click on that button, you actually find out a lot more. There's cutting instructions and sewing instructions and what you need information, right? And fabric options and design options. It's so thoughtful. And let's click on the cutting instructions because, sewing is really just the last thing you do when you're making a garment, really, right? There's a lot of work that goes in before. And it's really non-trivial, especially if you're just trying to break into this world. So check this out. I click on the cutting instructions, and yes, there is a lot of jargon, and you must pay attention, but it is all very clear and understandable once you, give it a try. And do you see the highlight there? For a long time, I remember what a mystery it was to me, how things had to be put together, literally the piecing together. I felt extremely, hopeless and helpless about it. But then this is all clarified in beautiful detail. So again, there's so much to be excited about. I won't go into more detail here, but I want to highlight another side to documentation, namely that coming back to this homepage of the docs, another thing that caught my eye here in this purple box is this sentence that says, if you're looking for developer or contributor docs, please refer to the freesewing.dev instead, right? So it's like, hey, if you're using designs, but if you want to make some of your own, click here, right? So of course I click there. And what I see is yet another beautiful page, again, very inviting and very motivational. Yes, indeed, to go fast, go alone, and to go far, go together. And I scroll down a little bit further because it's also engaging. And I find this beautiful piece there that says, Git could scrub, right? And it's two things caught my eye here. First of all, how ambitious it is. It says, look, there are people who are experts at sewing, but they don't know much about development. But if they want to create a design, I'll help them catch up, right? And that's the first thing. And the second thing that caught my eye there is I've actually gone through this training, and it's one of the best I've seen. By the way, Joost, I have already recommended it to people. And of course, this was just the entry point. There's a lot more to discover once you look at the top banner, and you find that the documentation is split into 4 big categories, which of course everybody here will bring to mind the taxis. Right? We have the tutorial, and we have the how-to guides and the reference. And these guides turn out to be a little bit of our explanation content. And when you click on them, you indeed find that the tutorial is this start-to-finish, end-to-end journey. And it thoughtfully includes, all sorts of things, like from the end to from end to end, including how to communicate with the user once you've created your design. The beginning of documentation, after all. And the how-to guides are to the point and give the generic recipe with useful links to the reference, right? All patterns which I think are excellent. And the reference contains this magical verb that I find so rarely in reference docs, namely the verb to be. See, there's this thing that says a snippet is. We are told what things are. People like to comment on what things do, but it's really, really empowering when you are told explicitly in no uncertain terms what something is. And the same goes for the settings article, for example. And finally, there's even a very beautiful explanation doc. So at this point, I was so excited. And I'm like, as a documentation professional, I'm in for sure. And I was so in that after spending the whole night browsing this content, I go to work the next day and tell all about it to my engineering colleagues and to my technical author colleagues, engineering colleagues and technical author colleagues, right, I do, and they start clicking, and they draw my attention to the fact that, in fact, it is possible to touch base with the person behind all of this, which is Joost. So I'm like, time to get in touch with this guy, and after misspelling his email address and also the subject line, thankfully the stars aligned, and he replied, and here we are. And everyone, I invite you to give a warm welcome to our guest of honor, Joost.
Wow. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Dora. That was a lot. I mean, you really have a way to people look good. I was already very appreciative and thankful to have been given the opportunity to join here with these people who care about documentation as I do, but also backed by Canonical as a big open source fan. That's very exciting. But now I feel a little bit embarrassed by all the nice things you said about me.
Don't worry, we'll get to the grilling part in a second.
Okay. Thank you. So yeah, my name is Joost. I tend to go by my first name because my last name is slightly embarrassing, but rest assured it means the cook in my mother tongue, which is Dutch. I don't live in Belgium, live in Holland, I live in Belgium. It's very close to it. My name is Joost, sounds like ghost, and I don't know. Dora, do you want to start grilling me? Do you want me to?
Yeah, so the first very difficult question is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Whatever you want to share, we want to know it.
Yeah, sure. Oh, gosh, where do I start?
But keep it under 5 minutes because I have follow-up questions.
Right. I will speed run what you need to know about Joost. So where do I start? Okay, so I'm a college dropout, and I start with that because I got into open source quite late, like in my late 20s. I think a lot of people sort of get exposed to it in university. That's why I'm saying I'm a college dropout. I don't really have much of a formal education. As a matter of fact, the Open Document Academy is the only one that will have me, I think. And so I got involved in open source. I actually looked it up, I think 20 years ago. In 2004, I contributed as a technical editor to the Linux documentation project. So my entry into open source was through documentation, which I think will be very familiar to all of the people here. And so because of my lack of education, I started with sort of blue-collar jobs, and then I got interested in computers. But when I'm going to be 48 this year, so I'm not very young. When I was young, it wasn't really that obvious of a career, and then I sort of pivoted into it, and then fell in love. Most of what not most of what I learned, of course, to read and write in school, but like all of the things that pay my bills, all of the skills that pay the bills, I learned because good-hearted people were willing to document them on the internet. 9 times out of 10, these are open source projects. So I feel an enormous amount of gratitude and debt towards, the open source community and people who document things and who make the effort to explain things. And I find, I wouldn't be where I am today, both as in like personal development and growth, and also just like, being able to afford a roof over your head and all of these things. And so in a way, I want to be one of those people. And while I don't think I am, I can try, do my best. So I work in IT, I work in cybersecurity, I work for the government, more specifically for the European Union. But I'm not one of those people who's all about their job. I do open source in my job, next to my job. I like to make clothes and shoes. I play a little bit of guitar. I don't have kids. I do have a wife. She has all of the degrees and the diplomas that I do not have. So the average is okay in our household.
Thank you so much. It was really good to find out more about you. And I wondering whether to dwell on any of that. What I want to say is that, in a sense, to me, that open source is this huge egalitarian place where it's all about merit and all about drive and all about doing things that mean something to you, right? And I can see that in your story, the story you just shared. Thank you for that. Now I will go to the next question. We can circle back. I do want to also leave room for people to ask, the rest of the people in the room to ask you questions. So that's why I'm just keeping this, forward motion, but then we might circle back. So my next question is, what gap were you trying to fill with this project? And I want to clarify a little bit. So I come from an academic background, linguistics in particular, and there, if everybody needs to kind of, whatever you write, you need to justify your existence. You need to prove that some idea did not exist, or you give a better version thereof or something, right? And coming into industry and open source, and I'm sometimes impressed, but also surprised at how shy people are to talk about the unique added value that the project brings to the, because to me it's about the problem space, right? There's this problem space, we're all trying to engage with it, and sometimes it's a known problem space, sometimes we study it and we find new problems, right? But either way, there's this problem space, and we feel a particular gap in it. So what gap were you trying to fill? And feel free to comment to make the question as specific or as broad as you wish.
Yeah, I think that what I did is something that a lot of people do, which is I started by scratching my own itch. I had a need, and in doing so, at a certain moment, I was like, this might benefit others, so why don't I open source it? Now, to explain a little bit what that need was, so I got into making clothes, I'm going to say about, it would be up to 15 years ago now, a little bit less, I think. I had a sewing machine, which I used just to fix things. I had taught myself this because my my mother was not very, she didn't like sewing. So when I had like ripped jeans or something as a teenager, she would like fix them, but she would like use black thread on blue jeans or something. And I was like, Mom, so embarrassing. So I had to teach myself how to do these things just out of sheer embarrassment. But then I didn't really, it was like a practical thing for me. Like, you should be able to fix things in and around the house, including clothes. That's just sort of a thing that I think is a useful life skill. But then at a certain moment, I got mononucleosis, which is like, the kissing disease, which if you get it as a grown-up, a lot of people get it when you're a kid, like it really knocks you out. Like I was at home for like 3 weeks and it spilled into the Christmas holidays. So by the end of it, I was like incredibly bored, but also I didn't really have a lot of energy to go out and do anything. So I was like, okay, I have this sewing machine, I will make something. And then I quickly realized that if you buy a sewing pattern, you have the exact same problem as the clothes in the shop. You buy something off the rack. It might fit you if you happen to be sort of like average or what the brand had in mind, but I'm quite tall, and so I had fitting issues. And so looking into this a bit more, I realized, you can just draft your own patterns. There's these books, that teach you how to go from taking your measurements and then, one corded chest to there, and then a little bit adding there, and then curve to there. And it's like, this is way better. And then I started doing that on paper, and, working in IT, I quickly was like, this got to be a better way, right? This can't be that easy. This can't be that hard to do on a computer. Yeah, that was 12 years ago. So here we are.
And of course, there are a few other open source projects around pattern drafting that have come on the market, but they are quite different. Can you comment a little bit on that? What I have in mind is projects like Seamly or the other fork, Valentina.
Yeah, so both Seamly and Valentina, indeed, two forks from the same stem, are a little bit similar, but there's quite important differences, I think. First of all, it's a graphical user interface where you click around to create your patterns. FreeSewing is patterns as code, right? So I think that's a little bit of a personal preference. I like the keyboard. I avoid the mouse if and when possible. So for me, writing something in code makes more sense. And then also it's written in C++. So you have this application that you download and that you install, and then you can do things with it. Whereas we didn't start out like this, but now everything is written in JavaScript, because I was like, we should be able to do this in the browser. If you want the pattern to be a bit more like this or like that, that should just work in your browser, and it does now. So it's a little bit more lightweight in the sense that you can just go to this website and try it out as you did. You don't have to download any software. You don't have to install it. You can also try it out on your phone, although editing a pattern on your phone is maybe a bit tricky.
It's kind of exactly how I started, to be honest. I was on my phone.
Yeah. So there's a number of differences, and I think one thing that we do, but it's not so much technical, it's more in our approach and our vision, is from the very start, I wanted everything to be parametric, you know, so I wanted to make sure that these patterns would fit a wide variety of people. Because in these drafting books, it's like, take a quarter chest and then add 1.5 inch. But like, we have a lot of users who make clothes for dolls, you know, like people who have dolls and who want cute outfits for them. And obviously, if you do add a 1.5 inch, well, that doesn't work for your doll, right? So we sort of make sure to translate all of that to a percentage of whatever measure is relevant to that. Typically, it's an amount of ease or something.
And
so we do
course,
parametric design in code in the browser. Seamly does, you know, it's a standalone application with a GUI editor, and it's not so parametric. They have some way of doing that there.
And of course, the huge difference there as well is the fact that the FreeSewing way, you can share the design you've created, right? In I don't know if you can do that. I mean, I guess in Simplitude you could pass around the patterns you've put together. So I take that back, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, so the way it works, I mean, this one take on. The way it works is like a design is written in code, and you basically, the input is a set of measurements, and then all of the options, the design options that you want. You know, I want the color like this and the sleeves like that. And so that's all that we sort of store if you save your pattern. So you can say, oh, I like that shirt you made. You can say, look, here are my settings. You just use them with your own measurements, and then you have the same shirt, but in your measurements. So, you know, that's kind of nice how you can share.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think, yeah. And I think that's, yes. I think that's goes back to, you know, this question of what gap were you trying to fill, and I think that's an important thing for all projects to emphasize more. I think that's something that users don't often get right away. They might fail to see the big point, right? So they might take the time to explore, but they might not also. It's just a reflection on the open source project I've interacted with, at least, where I see sometimes the problem. Now, next question maybe, and here we are going to turn to the open source side of things. I mean, we've already touched upon it, and I think it's really, really hard in this conversation. I'm really trying, like in the slides, it was really difficult for me to tease apart the, you know, the sewing and the open source and the docs, because they're also entangled, but I wanted to tease them apart just for the sake of clarity. But yeah, in this exercise of trying to tease things apart, let's move on to open source. And I noticed on Mastodon that your project now counts more than 100,000 community members. Is that correct? And my question is that correct? And how did you get here?
It is correct. We have this year passed the 100,000 registered, you know, activated users on the website. How did that happen? I have no idea. It is far more than I ever sort of expected and anticipated. We've been growing steadily for many years, but there's been a number of things that have caused a big spike. One was the COVID pandemic, where you know, at the very start of the pandemic, when masks were hard to find and hard to buy, and there was this drive to, you know, you can make masks at home. We had a pattern on the website, and we also made available just a simple PDF you could download, because it's a bit overkill to enter your measurements and, you know, just for a face mask. So we made it, you know, as simple as possible, and that got picked up by a number of outlets in the US, including, you know, Forbes and the New York Times even, and you know, this drew a lot of traffic to the site, and all of a sudden, you know, we were popular. That didn't last, of course, but it did put us on the radar of at least a number of people who then stuck around and knew about us. And apart from that, I don't really spend a lot of time on social media, so FreeSewing does a very poor job at marketing itself. I really think, Dora, we should we should have somebody like you to do that for us. But like
I am
every
not
now
on
and then-
social media, truth be told, mostly not.
no, but like just your sales pitch was incredible. But like every now and then there's a quote unquote influencer in the sewing sphere who will talk about us, and it's really incredible how much traffic that drives to the site. So I'm thankful for those people. But I don't do it myself, because if I'm being honest, I don't need 100,000 users. Like it causes more trouble than like at a certain moment it gets so big. Like we had to redesign certain things. Like we have a newsletter, and I used to just send it out through my personal Gmail account. But now we have almost 20,000 subscribers, and so that won't do because you will hit the limit. So now, we had to redo that. Now we use AWS SES. Like, like the size is gotten to the point where we have to do things differently because we're no longer a small website. And from a technical point of view, this is great, and it's a wonderful also learning opportunity, because you get to do things that you may not sometimes you don't get to do them in your day job. But like I didn't really ask for this, and I don't really know why. I'm thankful, of course, for all of the users, but I don't have a secret recipe of how to become successful. I think you just stick with it and hope that people appreciate what you're doing.
It must be the style, I would say, and it must be the docs. And this brings me to my last big question. Well, it may sprout follow-up tiny questions, but it's this project is obviously very serious about documentation, and the same cannot be said about a lot of other projects out there. So how did you come to this place where you take documentation so seriously? And I know that a lot of it was authored by yourself, because I can tell in the style and I can see the commits history. I have taken a look at your repo. Yeah. So how did you come to appreciate documentation and the need for it, and the what standards to bring it up to, and all of that?
Yeah.
It's genuinely surprising. It's impressive and surprising, right?
I think it's, I could say like, oh, I learned so much. I really think documentation is important. But like, to be honest, for me personally, it's just a necessity, because I am not talented enough to write code or do things that make sense from the very start. And what I find often is that when I try to document what I've done, that's when I realize, oh, that doesn't really make sense, or this is inconsistent because we use conf here and config there, or stuff like that. Things that when you're in the weeds in the code and you're just trying to get it to work, you're not really, or I mean, at least I'm not really always keeping the holistic view of does everything work together and make sense. And I find that when I document things, that's really part of the QA process for me, where I often go back and change things, because I realize that I'm trying to explain it, it's not intuitive and it doesn't make sense. That doesn't mean that I always, end up with, this is perfect. No, but I think that documentation is important, because it really improves my work. And I also feel that I need it because it's a big project and I don't really remember everything we've done or how things work. Like I myself use the documentation because I need to look up and then, oh yeah, right, now I got it again. But like, I can't keep all of that stuff in my head. Like I need to write it down, and I hope that others enjoy that too. And as an open source project, I think that if you want contributors, and we do, well, then you have to give them tools and handrails and help and guidance. It's not only saying like, yeah, contributions welcome. Like you have to try to make it as easy as possible for them, and documentation there, I think, plays an important role.
So you do documentation for selfish purposes, but you seem very, deliberate about it, right? So there's a particular approach to it that you follow, obviously, even when it is inconsistent and such. So, for example, the four big categories you have at the top, the guides, the how-tos, and the reference, and the tutorials. Like, how did you come to that understanding that that's a good setup to have in principle? Why do you follow it, even if it's just for yourself?
None of this sprung fully formed from my mind, but of course I also see what other people are doing, and we steal from the best. So yeah, as you mentioned, this is just the Ataxis framework that we apply. Well, we apply it for technical documentation where I think it really shines. We don't structure our documentation that way on the website for makers, because it's less obvious. Like, I think it works very well for a technical site, but like if people are looking for documentation on the pattern that they're going to make, they're not going to be like, is that reference, or like, I'm like, I think it's a great framework, but you also don't have to be a slave to it. Like if it doesn't really make sense for the use case, then you do your own thing. But I do really like it. And it's also like when we write codes, we're all about, don't repeat yourself. But in documentation, actually, we do repeat. Like it's fine to explain things 3 times in different ways in the reference. The explanation will be different than in a guide or in a how-to. And yeah, so these are all sort of things that I see from others, and that we try to implement. I have these sort of opinionated ideas of what documentation should be like. It should be well structured. The URLs should make sense. They should match the file system so that oh, where is this file if I want to fix something? We use Markdown. It goes in Git. These are sort of like, I don't want to say basic, because Markdown and Git is you've already lost, all of the. But here's my Word document to track changes crowd. Yeah, so I think the way that we do it is quite common in open source. But at the same time, if you step into like a company, I think that is not too tech savvy. I think a lot of people are, PDFs and Word documents on shared drives, and I hate that.
I have a lot of questions, actually. Like I said, I am, after all, a documentation professional, and it is my job to look at documentation with a critical eye. Something that you mentioned caught my ear, namely, you talked about this holistic view, and how when you write the docs, you're mostly like, hey, I'm developing and I want to keep track of what I'm doing, and shine a mirror light on it, and hold the mirror up to it, and so it can help me think, right? And yes, if it helps other people, good, right? But I like what you said about the holistic view, because sometimes I ask. So at Canonical, we're hiring a lot of technical authors at present, and as we interview them, one of the questions they often have is this about what do you think the unique added value of a technical author in a team of engineers can be? Because you often find engineers who are who write their first drafts pretty decently. Some are even very good writers, right? And there are a lot of ways that you can, but I try to push people to give me an answer on the unique added value, right? And I think there's a lot that goes into the job for sure, but I think this holistic perspective, being able to take out a bunch of docs and make them hold together as a whole, right? Make the product hold together as a whole, help people acquire this coherent mental picture of it all, even as they just engage with corner X or Y or Z, right? So I'm happy that you mentioned that. And on being deliberate, I like the rules you mentioned. Thank you for that. I'm also curious about some of the choices you made. So, for example, when you look at the menu and you had you had guides, which were what I would call, I think, roughly explanation docs in the Ataxis, how-to guides and reference and tutorials at the end. And in the Ataxis, for example, or in the way we do documentation, we always start with the tutorial, the idea being that people learn by doing, right? And that's, the handheld journey. And was that decision to start with the guides first, was that on purpose, or what led to that?
This is going to sound incredibly disappointing, but I think it's just in alphabetical order, and guides comes before tutorial.
That did cross my mind, actually, to be honest. That did cross my mind.
The reason being that I think it makes sense if you have a landing page and you want to guide people through, like, hey, start with this and start with that. But like if we're talking about just the navigational structure in a nav bar, I'm like alphabetic will do, because
Mhm.
I'm not so sure that having guides on the left and then tutorials on the right, or vice versa, I don't think that will make or break the documentation experience for visitors. So I just sort of like, I think it makes sense to lead people in when you write and say like, oh, you should maybe try this to try this. But the navigation structure just mimics the folder structure, Tutorials is a folder, tutorials, guides is a folder pad, so it's alphabetic. Sorry, I kept it simple.
On that point, actually, there is a corner of the documentation set that I maintain where I follow an alphabetical order. It's in our reference docs. I've taken this approach where the reference docs are basically the dictionary to the product.
Yeah.
But maybe another follow-up question. I'll try to keep it really small. There's a whole backstory there, and I will not go into it. But it does come from linguistics, and the idea is that in all successful communication, there's this mutual assumption what you're saying is true, relevant, in the right amount, and in the right form. So when I switched to documentation a few years ago, that was the tool I had in my hand to look at things. I was like, it must be, docs must be, what makes good documentation good? Well, it must be true, relevant, in the right amount, and in the right form, right? And then I also came to think a lot about form, namely how it can have value in itself. For example, I noticed in your tutorial how you have these code blocks, and when you're making a change just in a certain place, your rendering mechanism helps you distinguish. You can highlight lines in the code block, right? And that's very helpful for sure, because you get the context plus also the highlights of what's new. So there's the manner, has value in good manner in itself, but often good manner can also help, can support, can help you keep things true and relevant and in the right amount. And one of the things I also noticed in your documentation set, and I think that's used widely in documentation, is, for example, admonishments, right? When you tips or notes, which are basically, they're by the ways, right? They're trying to stay out of the way, but still there if you need them. And it's a very so in my opinion, that's one of those examples where good form supports relevance, for example. Like it helps, like all the main text is focused on the question at hand, on it's at issue content, so to put it. But then you also provide other non-at issue content wherever it's convenient. So do you have any, so I guess here's my question. What are your strategies to keep your docs true, relevant, in the right amount and in the right form?
Right. I don't have a strategy for that specifically because I don't have the academic background to even phrase that question. However, I do have some opinions on what makes good documentation. And one of the things that I try to tell people is that you should not write documentation for people who already know all the answers. Because often people document things, but they make a lot of assumptions about, oh, you probably know this, or you probably know that. But I try to write, I mean, it's a little bit different for reference documentation. If you're looking up the exact arguments to a method or something, well, it's okay. But like in general, I try to explain things. And then, as you say, if you're talking about something and you can't really go into depth about assumptions or prerequisites that people should know, maybe there's like a little admonition or a tip, or like, hey, if you want to learn more about this, click there or here. So just in general, I try to write for somebody who is interested, who wants to learn, who is eager, but has no particular, like who doesn't really know, like who's absolutely new to this, whether that's sewing or free sewing in general. So that's the sort of documentation I try to write. When it comes to these admonitions, I think that we need to try to keep the reader engaged, right? And so it's not only the fact that you can link to more information, you also want to break up a little bit the wall of text that, can sort of happen if you take your time to explain things. You're going to end up with a bunch of text. And then apart from that, there's a number of, but then it gets quite technical, of course, of things that we do to try to raise the documentation to a better level. Like you already mentioned, code blocks. So we have code examples, and the code example is also rendered, so you can see what's happening. And this is actually the actual code is rendered, so we don't have to maintain like what it looks like in the code. No, this also happens automatically. We have things like terminology, like you saw that good sites together thing that has this dashed line under. So the way that works is, when writing documentation, you have all of this jargon that is obvious to people who do this regularly, but that can really create a barrier to entry for new users who are like, I have no idea what this is, good sites together. What does that even mean? And so having to explain that every time you mention it, I mean, that gets tired quickly, and it's a big ask for people to always link to the exact page. So we came up with a system where we basically hijack the HTML tag. So we use shout out to MDX, which is a JavaScript project that lets you write Markdown with sort of like JSX syntax. And long story short, what it does, it sort of takes your Markdown apart and compiles it into HTML. But then for each tag, if you want, you can say, actually, for that tag, I'm going to have a custom render method. So what we do is the M tag that people use for emphasis to make things italic. We hijack that tag, and we have a custom implementation. And so we check the content, and if it's a word on our jargon list, then we make that a button, underlined, that you can click, and then there's a modal window that loads that content. So why is that great? It's because for a documentation writer, all you have to do is this jargon or terminology thing. You just have to emphasize it, which is like underscore, the word underscore. This is a very low effort for people who are writing. Yet the end result is that you have this underscore tag, and then we choose to load it in a modal window because, M is an inline tag. So it's not always obvious. You don't really know where it's going to be. So to avoid having to nest the explanation in a paragraph somewhere, we just take over the entire screen, and then you can just click that away like any other modal window. So, that's one thing. We also, for a different open source project, we have pages explaining concepts like, like broker nodes. And then also, if you emphasize that, it will automatically turn into a link to that page. So these are all little technical help things to fix these common issues of like, how do you make sure that every time you use a jargon term, to the new user, they can find the explanation, but you don't want to bore your writers and your readers by including that every time. Like, where do you strike a balance there?
First of all, I must admire the creativity, which is there always. Like, I love the creativity there, hijacking the little thing. And second, I want to comment on this thing you emphasized of minimizing effort on the writer. Everybody in documentation will emphasize the user, right? And it is true, we write for the user. But if you do that at too high a cost for the writer, you are undermining the results for the user as well. That's guaranteed. That's 100% a fact. So I like the care you take to make the job easy for the writer too. And we are really, time is flying, I must say. And I do have one last comment, because I really want to open up the floor for other questions. But there's, I noticed you have, user docs and then developer docs, but the developer docs, in my opinion, are still user docs. They're just for the ambitious users who want to create designs, right? And what I was looking for next, and it's something that is very much in my mind in my own documentation set at the present, is developer docs, as in FreeSewing project developer docs. And I'm asking because, of course, a contributing guide is the smallest incarnation of such a doc, right? I want to bring that sort of documentation in focus because, of course, at the Open Documentation Academy, the thing we do is we create documentation issues. Graham can tell us more about that. We give people this place where issues in documentation, in open source documentation, can be filed, and random people on the internet can contribute if they wish to, right? Can pick them up. And if you ever want the issues, the documentation-related issues in the FreeSewing project to get help through this channel, then yes, watch, take another look at the contributing guide and show me the developer docs.
It's true that, so first of all, I want to talk a little bit about why we decided to have a completely different website with developer docs, which are also user docs. And one of the main reasons is that documentation really needs good search to shine, because you can have wonderful documentation, but if people can't find it, you know, it's not that great. By the way, shout out to Algolia, who offer free search for many open source projects, including ours. And these days they even crawl the website for us. You don't even have to like run the integration and stuff like that. So that's great. But like, if all of our developer documentation was mixed in with our, you know, how to make this pattern documentation, then when people are searching for something, they would like find a bunch of results about, you know, that are probably entirely irrelevant to what they're trying to do in that moment. So that's one of the reasons that we split it. I mean, it's not just a search, but just in general, people are looking at their documentation on freesewing.org are looking for something completely different than people are looking at freesewing.dev. Now, when you say like, oh, documentation for contributors, this is a weak point, but it's a weak point because we've put our points and our money and our efforts somewhere else, in the sense that one of the things that I really wanted to focus on was I wanted to make it easy for people to contribute designs, right? Because FreeSewing now has more than 50 designs, but like we had one initially and then two and then three. And first it was always me creating them. But you know, that doesn't really scale. I only have 2 hands and 24 hours in every day like everybody else. So I really made a conscious effort to create the guide for design and how to do it and how to get started, and invested a lot of time and effort in that. But not so much in, okay, but what else can you do to help with the project? Unfortunately. And I'm the victim of that, because it's been a great success. We have a lot of designs that have been contributed, but a lot of the other work still falls on my shoulder because it's much harder to get involved with that. It's also more of a moving target because, you know, we're constantly sort of changing things, whereas the core library and the API remains a lot more stable than the whole project as such. So it's harder to maintain that documentation. I mean, that's maybe a bit of an excuse, but like, I know it's a weak point. Getting involved with FreeSewing for how can I, you know, help you with this mono repo stuff, and yeah, it's not so easy.
No, the reason it came to mind is precisely because it's a challenge I'm trying to handle right now in my own documentation set. And the reason I was able to quickly identify, you know, this like 2 types of users, the users and the user contributed, you know, that are contributing designs, is because in the product I document, Juju, we have the same issue, right? Or the same architecture, the same general logic. There's this engine, and then there are these things called operators or charms. And we want people to start, you know, people engaging with the ecosystem would be probably contributing charms rather than contributing to the, you know, Juju code base. So for that same reason, our own developer dogs were neglected for a long time, and now we are trying to get serious about them. So that's why I noticed. At this point, I really want to open up the floor. Also, Joost, if there was anything you would like to share and I haven't asked, please do. We want to hear everything you want to share. And everyone, questions for Joost?
Please go ahead.
Phil's got his hand up.
I'll go ahead since I didn't see anybody else. So your website potentially solves a big problem for me. I've been sewing for a really long time, probably since that avatar picture was taken when I was like 18. But I've gravitated toward doing commissions for people who do Ren fairs and Dungeons and Dragons kits. It's medieval clothing and medieval baggage, backpacks, packs, pouches, things like that. About a year ago, I bought our ancestral home and we've been renovating it. So I promised to put my hobbies on the side, and I have had a lot of people be really sad. Now I realize I can take some of my patterns and put them up there and say, go here, follow the everything you need to know is here, how to do all of this stuff. Here's the pattern, here's how you use it. So, but I guess my question is, there are lots of other sites like that for other people that play the violin or work on tractors or build, you know, bio environments, but you don't know about them because they never make it to the top of the list. What can we do as open source aficionados to help make sites like yours get to the top of the list?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we're not very good at marketing, and when I look at other endeavors, whether that's small independent pattern companies or people with a sewing channel or something like that, I think the ones that are on the top of the list are the ones who really look after that aspect of things. But it's not that interesting to me. I prefer to write code or documentation or do something like that. I think the team works best when everybody plays to their strengths. But I think that we have now sort of entered this era where everybody has their own brand and is sort of doing their own thing. And I think a couple of years ago, it was easier to find a volunteer to look after the social media accounts for an open source project. These days, in practice, we don't really have anybody who wants to do that. So I'm not saying you have to do that, but if you're asking me what is an obvious way to help the project, that is something, because being on Instagram or TikTok or Mastodon or Blue Sky or Facebook, where a lot of old ladies with sewing machines are, that really drives eyeballs to the website, for better or for worse. So that is something where I think there's a lot of room for improvement and growth there. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Let's put it that way.
Cool. I will try and give that job to my wife, who is apparently glued to social media all the time. So that might work.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Hi. First of all, I'm really impressed by this project. I was very excited when Dora shared the link with me. Actually, it was not Dora, but it was someone that Dora had talked to about it. So, word travels really fast. It's really great. And, I thought it was funny when you mentioned sewing for dolls, because that's what I've been doing for many years. I mean, not now, I don't really have time now, and it is very different than sewing for adults and like full-size bodies. I think I will become one of your fans. And we're running out of time, but I just really wanted to share my appreciation, because it's really amazing what you have done. And I think it's well deserved that you grew such a huge audience.
Thank you. It means a lot, really. Thank you.
Jeffrey's left a comment to say, I have a project to put together shop aprons for a cohort of mechatronics students in Durango, Mexico. I know where I'm going to get started on arming that project.
It's funny that you say that, because I picked that apron design totally randomly. It seems to have caught your eyes.
Can I ask something? It seems that Joost, you have a real flair for design. I see it in everything that you've done on the site and in the documentation. Where does that come from?
That's a bit of a joke, right? Graphic design is my passion. People who are terrible at it. I don't know. I mean, I don't have any formal background in graphic design, but I think that a little bit of polish goes a long way, trying to make things look nice. I'm not good at it. I know people who are amazing at it, but I'm also not good at writing code or writing documentation, because comparison is the thief of joy. I do my best. I think I've gotten much better, but there's always people who are better. So I just I do my best and I try to make it look nice, but I don't know if it's like. I would not call it looks great myself. I would not say that. I say like, yeah, I've seen worse, but I just see the room for improvement,
Yeah.
Good practice, of course. It really helps with modesty. But I really want to know the story behind that logo. Because it caused quite a debate in my engineering team, and we were speculating about what it means. And to me, it was obvious. It obviously meant "I'll sew till I die." So, what's your story?
Right. So Scully, as we call our logo, when I started FreeSewing.org website, it was a bit of a rebrand, because before it was called makemypattern.com, but it was not open source. So when I decided, like, okay, I have something working here, I want this to be open source, I sort of wanted a name that represented that. So I went with FreeSewing, free as in, FreeBSD, and it's not an unusual suffix in open source. And I also thought, well, if people are going to be Googling free sewing patterns, which a lot of people do, then maybe that will also help. But like in the world of sewing, everything, I mean, not everything, but like 99% is of a certain vibe, it's like sort of cutesy, ladylike, stuff. And I wanted it to be very clear, this is something completely different. And so I have a friend who is an artist, and I talked to her about this, and I was like, I think we should go with skull, like just to sort of immediately put people on the back foot of like, is this a sewing website? What's going on here? And so she came up with the design, and then we simplified it a bit so that, we can put it on merch and stuff. And that's backstory. I'm very happy with it. But yeah, it has a sort of signaling function of, this is not your average sewing website.
And indeed it is not. So we are at time. I'm wondering if there's anything, any lingering questions, anything you kind of want to ask but are too shy. Now's the time. Don't be shy.
I mean, not a question, but I am now considering picking up a new hobby starting a new year. So thank you very much for your presentation. This was lovely.
It's a perfect time of the year for that sort of stuff. Also, if you can reach out to me, like, you don't have to, if you have questions but you're a little bit shy to take the stage here, yeah, you can reach me. It's not a problem.
And Neve, was that a raised hand or?
I was trying to applaud and I clicked the wrong one.
Now we can, upload into the microphone. Thank you so much, Joost. It's been a pleasure, a great pleasure.
Likewise.
I hope I'm sure people will get in touch or stay in touch. I know I will. Thank you. Everyone have a lovely rest of the day and a lovely weekend, and happy Christmas. If we don't meet again, I think there is actually a Coda end of the year party coming up in 2 weeks, right, Graham?
Yeah, I mean, we actually have another demo next week with somebody who contributed to Coda with some interactive restructured text.
Yep.
But yeah, it's been really wonderful. Thank you. Thanks both so much. It's really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me. This has been an absolute highlight of my year, so I really appreciative.
Thank you. Bye,
Thanks.
everyone.